All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. Welcome to today's BC Support Unit webinar. This will be about an hour in length. My name is Alia Januwala. I'm from the BC Support Unit Fraser Center in the Fraser-Salish region, and I'm here to host a webinar titled Applying Behavior Change Theory to Improve Bowel Care Routines for Individuals Living with Chronic Spinal Cord Injury, the Importance of an Integrated Knowledge Translation Approach, presented by Vera-Ellen Lucci and Dr. Chris McBride. I would like to start this webinar by acknowledging the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, from whose traditional lands we are leading this webinar today. You may have noticed that we've muted you as you've joined the webinar to avoid background noise during the presentation. We do encourage you to use the chat box to share any questions for a discussion at the end of the presentation, or if you have any issues throughout the presentation. The chat box can be found in the top right area of your screen, so please feel free to shoot me, the host, a question or a message, and I can share that with the presenters as well. At the end of the presentation, your microphone will be unmuted so that you can ask your question using the microphone or via the chat box, whichever you'd prefer. This webinar is also being recorded, and it will be available on our website, bcsupportunit.ca, under resources, so that you can access it later and share it with your friends and colleagues, and we please urge you to do so. So at this time, I'd like to really get into the presentation. I'd like to start off by briefly introducing our lovely presenters we have with us today. So first, Vera-Ellen Lucci is a PhD candidate in the Department of Biomedical Physiology and Kinesiology under the supervision of Dr. Victoria Clayton, studying the autonomic consequences of a spinal cord injury. Her research experiences have transformed her thesis from its physiological-centric beginnings to a translational, patient-oriented approach. Vera recently completed a one-year BC Support Unit graduate student fellowship in patient-oriented research and will be using this presentation to describe her approach. Since 2010, Dr. Chris McBride has served as the Executive Director of Spinal Cord Injury, British Columbia, where he brings a passion for making a difference for people with disabilities and their families. He also brings 25 years of experience as a researcher and research community network builder. Presently, he is on the executive of the SSHRC-funded Canadian Disability Participation Project and chairs Spinal Cord Injury Canada's Executive Directors Council. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Vera and Chris to our webinar and bring things over to them to start things off for us.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alia. So as you heard, today we'll be presenting on applying behavior change theory to improve bowel care routines for individuals living with a chronic spinal cord injury. And we thought we'd start some things off today with a little bit of an introduction for us both. So as you heard, my name is Vera. I'm currently doing my PhD here at SFU under the supervision of Victoria Clayton. Before that, I completed an honors degree in kinesiology at McMaster University. And upon beginning graduate studies, I had an initial interest in cardiovascular physiology. And our lab, part of our lab specifically looks at the cardiovascular complications associated with the spinal cord injury. So this grew my thesis into this multidisciplinary approach aimed at this central theme. And through that, I have some basic science, some clinical science, and now some behavior change science as well happening. So this has shifted my research into a translational approach, and you'll be sure to see that throughout the remainder of this presentation. I've been fortunate enough to work throughout my research career with Spinal Cord Injury BC, and today we have their Executive Director, Chris McBride, co-presenting with me.
Great. Thanks, Vera. Yeah, and contrary to the name on my Zoom window, I'm not Jocelyn Effin. I am indeed Chris McBride. Jocelyn is my Manager of Information Services, and I'm using her account today. Yeah, this slide just sort of highlights my progression over the years. I started as a cellular neurobiologist and have slowly made my way along this continuum to what is probably considered patient-oriented research, although I'll caution that we don't use that term patient in our services at Spinal Cord Injury BC. We typically refer to the people we serve as members, sometimes as consumers or research users as well. Anyway, the slide just highlights essentially also the various roles I've had as it pertains to knowledge translation, from the researcher side to the funder and research center program side, and now as a community partner. So seeing all sides of the knowledge translation continuum, and believe very strongly in the importance of it.
And to give everyone an understanding of spinal cord injury in Canada, we have some statistics here, and these statistics have been provided by the Rick Hansen Institute, which has recently rebranded themselves as the Praxis Institute. And these stats were released a few years ago, so given the trajectory of these stats, we know that there are over 90,000 Canadians living with the devastating consequences of a spinal cord injury. And a large majority of these individuals are male. However, regardless of their sex, we know that the leading cause of morbidity and mortality after spinal cord injury is cardiovascular disease. And although that's the same as it is with the general population, in spinal cord injury, we see a decrease in life expectancy by anywhere between 15 and 30 years. And this can be in part contributed to a 4 times faster onset of cardiovascular disease. And in addition, there's a significant economic and personal financial burden that's associated with not only the acute phase of spinal cord injury, but the management of secondary complications that persist in the chronic phase. And to give a little bit of a picture of what spinal cord injury looks like in BC, Chris is a lot more knowledgeable.
All right, so here in BC, there's an estimated 10 to 12,000 people with spinal cord injury. And since 1957, Spinal Cord Injury BC has been around to help people with spinal cord injury and their families adjust, adapt, and thrive as they deal with a new injury or as they struggle with the ongoing challenges of living and aging with a physical disability. That's kind of our corporate talk. What I really like is one of our members who let us know that we're the go-to place for information and support from people who really know what you're going through and how to get you back into real living. And so we deliver our services through our peer support service and our information services. So this is, I think, a couple things that make Spinal Cord Injury BC unique is we are truly a provincial organization. And I'm pretty proud to say that over half of our staff are indeed people with spinal cord injuries themselves. And we have a couple of other people with different kinds of disabilities as well. So that part about really knowing what you're going through and how to get support is borne out through our staff members who deliver service in pretty much every region of the province. And so in addition to the peer support and information services, we've always been really invested in research. We believe very strongly in the importance of research. And we also believe really strongly in the importance of engaging our membership in research, not just as research participants, but also as contributors to the entire research process, which is really what integrated knowledge translation is all about. And this slide here just illustrates some of the many partnerships that we have in research. And I will say that because of our relationship with our membership and people with spinal cord injuries, researchers are very interested in working with us to try to reach those individuals. And I typically get up to one or more requests to partner a week, and we have to say no to a lot of them, and the ones that we do say yes to have to meet certain kind of guidelines that we've set aside for ourselves, and really they relate to the integrated knowledge translation guidelines, principles of which we are developing with Dr. Heather Gameforth actually at UBC's Okanagan campus. And you can find out more about that on Michael Smith's Foundation for Health Research's KT Connect's website, where we have a couple of blog posts, some webinars and videos and stuff that talk about the important things, factors that go into us deciding whether to partner with a research group or not. But suffice to say that we really only engage in research projects that we'll have a meaningful role in, and Vera and Dr. Clayton's lab are excellent examples of research who understand how to engage a community organization like ours in not just recruiting for patients, but in informing the entire research process.
Thanks, Chris. So in our lab, we have a focus on cardiovascular physiology and the complications that elicit, or the parts of spinal cord injury that elicit cardiovascular complications. And one of those things specific is bowel care. And we're going to talk a lot today about bowel care and bowel care practices. But previous interventions, and I'm going to say interventions in past decades, have really focused on motor and sensory deficits following spinal cord injury. And but that we now know represents a disconnect between the longstanding priorities in research and the priorities for individuals living with a spinal cord injury. So with a spinal cord injury, there's impairments to the nerve pathways that are responsible for movement and sensation, but also for autonomic processes. And these are things like bladder, bowel, and sexual function, and the ability to regulate cardiovascular control. And not only is this dysfunction to these autonomic pathways considered important clinically, its improvement to them is prioritized for individuals who live with a spinal cord injury. So in a seminal paper by Kim Anderson, and Kim Anderson is not only a spinal cord injury researcher, she also lives with a high-level spinal cord injury. Individuals were asked for the first time what their priorities were. And this paper was only published in 2004. And regardless to their level of injury, whether they had a spinal cord injury that affected their lower limbs or all four limbs, improvements to autonomic function were ranked as higher priorities than that to improvements of walking. And this sentiment was echoed by a research group in the UK, by Maureen Crawgrave and her group, in 2009, where a large postal survey went out, and bladder, bowel, and sexual function were all related as having a higher impact to quality of life over that of wheelchair use. So we know that bowel care is a long-standing priority after spinal cord injury. And most recently, these concerns have been echoed by our research group, where we surveyed 287 individuals who primarily live within British Columbia, who live with a spinal cord injury, about their bowel care practices and the associated cardiovascular concerns that they have. A staggering 86% of our respondents say that they fit their lives around their bowel care. And a third of our respondents also experience fecal incontinence at least once per month. So surprisingly, many respondents voiced their dissatisfaction with their care, yet a large percent of them had not changed their care for the last 5 years. And we've been working with spinal cord injury dissemination and recruitment of this. And one of their publications, the SPIN, which I think Chris can talk about a little bit more, has been really integral for us to disseminating our results to the community here in BC.
Right, so communications are a big part of the work that we do here at Spinal Cord Injury BC, and we believe very strongly that if we're engaged in research, that that we should be going back and letting our membership know what the results of that research were. And our Spin magazine is probably our most valued communications asset that we have. It goes out to over 4,000 addresses every quarter. And we feature, as I said, a lot of research related articles, a lot of living with spinal cord injury related peer support kind of related stories as well. And we also use this as a platform for recruitment. So we think that giving information not just about the study, but about the outcomes also facilitates further engagement by our membership in research. And we've been really proud to present the work that Vera and Dr. Clayton's lab has undertaken over the last few years.
And another communication tool that Chris and his team have used are small informative videos about upcoming research. So in a follow-up to our survey, we conducted a clinical trial, and some time ago, I was featured by Spinal Cord Injury BC on a small little snippet to convey the importance of this clinical trial, which I'll talk about a little bit after. But they were able to put out this communication tool in order to disseminate the type of research that we are continuing to do in bowel care. So I'll just play this for you now.
When was the last time you saw a short research pitch? AD is a really important complication of spinal cord injury, and I hear you've got a study about AD and bowel care that you're going to tell me about, but you only have 45 seconds. Ready? Go.
Sure. Okay, so individuals who participate in our study have the ability to earn up to $200. They also, yeah, it's really great. And they're also, I'm also will be accompanied by a nurse continence advisor, so they'll be able to receive advice on how to improve on their bowel care and bladder routines. They're also, the study is also done in the individual's home. So we offer that as convenience so that we know it's a very private matter, taking care of their bowel routine. So we want to make them feel as comfortable as possible.
Nice. Can you tell me a bit more about it?
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're trying to assess how a medicated lubricant will mediate the effects of high blood pressure that is often seen during an individual's bowel care routine.
You got it all the way in. Nicely done.
Okay, so that video was put out a few years ago and a follow-up to the survey that I mentioned we had done. Because based on the priorities raised in the survey, we wanted to test some clinical recommendations to mitigate the cardiovascular burden that people were reporting on that we know that happens during bowel care. And one point I would like to make is that bowel care is more than an inconvenience. It takes time, and in most cases, it requires various interventions to provoke defecation. So in higher level spinal cord injury, this provocation elicits physiological pathways, and I'd be happy to talk about that later for individuals who are interested in those pathways. But just know that those pathways result in dangerously high blood pressure. And that high blood pressure, in terms of spinal cord injury, that response can be known as autonomic dysreflexia. So this tracing here on the left here shows this sharp increase in pressure once bowel care begins, and bowel care is denoted by the dark gray box. And this results in high blood pressure that happens consistently. And this level of high blood pressure during defecation is not seen in able-bodied populations. These high pressures to bowel care have been associated with acute complications like cardiac arrhythmia. So we can see irregular cardiac electrical activity seen here on the right. They've also been associated with stroke and chronic complications like the earlier onset of cardiovascular disease that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So through our community survey, it became apparent that cardiovascular complications were extremely detrimental to quality of life, and we thought to test the efficacy of one proposed strategy to improve cardiovascular control during bowel care. So we tested an anesthetic lubricant that in theory should block the blood pressure response to bowel care seen in high-level spinal cord injury. And just so you know, a standard lubricant is really common during bowel care for things like inserting suppositories or performing digital stimulation to provoke a reflexive defecation. So the rationale was that if we could provide a medicated lubricant that might blunt this blood pressure response, it would be a really low barrier change for individuals to make to their care routines. But the summary, the short story is that the intervention doesn't really work as intended. It made using a medicated anesthetic lubricant made bowel care longer, blood pressure higher. The product of these was associated with an increased burden of that dysreflexia response, as well as we saw a statistically higher proportion of irregular heartbeats during bowel care using the anesthetic lubricant when compared to a placebo lubricant. So, and self-reportedly, participants felt that their bowel care was more difficult on the days when they were using the anesthetic lubricant versus the days using their placebo. So what remains apparent is that we needed to conduct this research away from a controlled laboratory setting because studies had been done in this in a very controlled setting that proposed its efficacy and its usability. However, in a real world setting, working with people with spinal cord injury to develop this study and examine how clinical implications can work in the real world, we were able to essentially disprove the efficacy of this proposed recommendation. So this begs some obvious questions. Bowel care is problematic. It's associated with high cardiovascular complications with large levels of dissatisfaction. So why are people not making a change to their bowel care routine to mitigate these things and to improve quality of life and satisfaction? And from our standpoint as researchers interested in cardiovascular responses as well as bowel care procedures, how can we help? So before we can help, we have to understand what prevents people from making a change to their bowel care and what facilitates them to make a change that will inevitably improve quality of life and satisfaction. It turns out that the tools I regularly use as a physiologist can't really capture this. So we needed to design a study that was rooted in behavior change theory. And we have partnered with, as well with Dr. Heather Gameforth at UPCO, who is a behavior change scientist, to help develop and teach the physiologists how this might work. So behavior change theory, at its core, is concerned with an individual's capability, opportunity, and motivation to produce change. And within these three key factors, we can see there's been 14 subdomains that have been identified. And once an individual expresses their barriers and facilitators to change, this is usually done over a structured interview, we can map those barriers and facilitators to one or more of those subdomains, which can help us link them to the most appropriate intervention function, as well as policy procedure to enable change. And by grounding this work in behavior change theory, we can make use of this evidence-based framework to apply theoretical approaches to interventions that are aimed at producing change. So for an example, how this might work is if there is someone's care aid ability to change their care in a way that an individual might like because they lack the ability. The barrier to that might be fall within the subdomain of skills. So the care aid lacks the physical skills, and therefore the intervention function may be training, would be linked to training, and a policy procedure would be to improve guidelines aimed at training. So, of course, it is absolutely imperative that we consult our knowledge user from the beginning. This is an approach that is known to us as integrated knowledge translation, or IKT, as you may have heard of it. In part, our knowledge user base began with our community survey. It grew with our clinical trial, and it's continuing with our present study. And ultimately, this aims to ensure that the end result is both relevant and useful to our knowledge users. So to summarize the proposed study that I was funded by the BC Support Unit for the last year, we are aiming to investigate the barriers and facilitators to making a change to a bowel care routine. However, the IKT is not didn't start with this. We had a long journey and a relationship that is formed with Spinal Cord Injury BC to make this study possible, and we thought we would bring you through a little bit of that timeline.
Right. So I think one of the important things certainly for Spinal Cord Injury BC as a community partner, is that we need to work with researchers that we trust, and you don't just build trust based on a single email or phone call. You do that over time, and we undertook, as Vera said, quite a bit of work on a number of different projects over a period of time. And I think it's important, like especially for a project like Vera's, which involves a very personal and sensitive subject, where the people involved need to have full trust in the research team, and they need to trust us to connect them with researchers that we know that they can trust. So I think the work that we did on these surveys and the dissemination work that we did and the trials and whatnot has been really important and has led to this work that Vera is doing now.
Yeah, and then that made it really important to us as researchers to include Chris and his team in the complete formation of the present study. So we did that. We wrote ethics together. We acquired seed funding together. We wrote a project grant together that was ultimately funded. And Chris was able to support me in my application for my BC Support Unit Fellowship. And all of this feeds on each other to ultimately achieve our goals, our ultimate goal, but working together means that everything is relevant and feasible and going to be most applicable to our knowledge users. So we were able to co-create a lot of meaningful research that has come out of questions that have raised from our previous projects together. So in specific to the study that we are currently conducting together, this is where our community collaboration proves absolutely essential to project completion. We could not do this without our community involvement. So invitations to participate are sent out through email, through Spinal Cord Injury BC and the connections that they have with the spinal cord injury community. Interested individuals then complete an online recruitment survey to determine their eligibility. And then we're making use of something called maximum variation sampling, which means that with a small sample population, we can have a population that is most representative of the demographic of spinal cord injury in BC. So we are using some statistical tools there. And then we're conducting 1-hour semi-structured interviews with these participants, and we discuss their barriers and facilitators to making changes in their bowel care. So what helps and what hinders and what they have done or what they are hoping to do to make these changes. And then we transcribe these interviews verbatim for analysis. And analysis happens in a 3-phase approach. So we base it in the behavior change theory that I had discussed before, where we map the barriers and facilitators to the subdomains, and then we use those domains to uncover themes about the barriers and facilitators to making change to bowel care. And then we use this information to make something that's known as behavioral diagnosis. And in turn, we look at this diagnosis and use the behavior change wheel to make recommendations for interventions going forward. And to date, we have interviewed 9 individuals with a spinal cord injury in BC about their bowel care, about the barriers and facilitators to making change in their bowel care. These individuals have a wide range of spinal cord injury levels as well as severities, with recruitment and analysis still presently ongoing for this study. And without formal analysis being completed, I thought I would pull up some snapshots of what the information we are getting. So these are not necessarily themes that will emerge or persist, but they are quotations that have stuck out with me as something that is important and addresses things we already know about the challenges with bowel care routines. So if we look at the box in gray, this participants say, I know more about bowel care than my doctors do. So the barriers that their healthcare provider doesn't know enough about bowel care, which would fall into the knowledge domain, and then an intervention function that is linked to the knowledge domain would be improving training. So this would be training for healthcare providers. In blue, the barrier to changing here was not prioritizing or attending to change. So this individual said, I know that there are health reasons to do it, but it's like overcoming the inertia and to focus on it. So this is linked to the memory, attention, and decision-making domain. That's a big one, but it's all one domain. And the potential intervention functions could focus on training or environmental restructuring that enable an individual to make change. The quote in red is really interesting. This is a facilitator to make change. This individual said the pain was incredible. It forced my hand to take it more seriously on how to get things going. So the facilitator to change here was pain. And pain acted as a reinforcement to change. It incentivized this individual to make a change to their bowel care. And even though pain is a negative outcome, in this case, it facilitated the individual to make a change and acted as an incentive for change. So this analysis is really basic, but it will be going forth in a more formal way, and ultimately we will have emerging themes that will be able to be mapped to a more specific intervention function that we can test going forward. So our next steps are to complete our data collection and start our coding and mapping of these barriers and facilitators. Once we have those and those themes emerge, we'll be working with Chris and his group to see how the themes align with the community. And then we will create this behavioral diagnosis and design intervention studies that will be most applicable to our knowledge users. Our ultimate goals are to inform research, inform decision-making and policy procedures, and also to facilitate behavior change that is ultimately aimed at improving quality of life for individuals living with chronic spinal cord injury. And in summary, our experiences together are highlighting the importance of integrated knowledge translation that ensures that the research we do is feasible, relevant, and impactful to the community that we are working with. And with that, we have some people we would like to thank. I would like to thank Alia and the team at BC Support Unit for giving us this opportunity, as well as thanking you, Chris, for coming on and doing this webinar with me, but also for all the support you've provided me personally and our research over the last years.
That's great, Vera. I just, it's so awesome to work with such great people as Vera and Victoria's lab, but I also should acknowledge that we have a really progressive partnership with the ICORD Spinal Cord Injury Research Center at UBC and Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute, whereby we have a formal agreement that supports participation by people with spinal cord injury in research, and it's been incredibly I think important and helpful from both sides, particularly with recruitment, but I think as this study demonstrates with broader input around the entire research process.
Yeah, and before we take our questions, there's just this slide that I put into most of my presentations. It's something that's really powerful to me, as is the work that we do and the impact that it can have on our community. So I would just like to read this to you. The loss of autonomic functions and not simply the inability to walk robs people living with paralysis of time. The ongoing management of body temperature, sexual function, bladder, and bowel shave hours off of our days and sometimes full experiences from our lives. If ignored, the possibility of far more permanent loss. The fact is, paralysis alone will not kill me. The secondary conditions of paralysis, especially without steadfast management, can kill me. And because an injured spinal cord struggles to communicate with the brain, to operate a host of bodily functions most of us take for granted, too often they do contribute to death. Time is not on our side. And this is something I return to as an autonomic physiologist and someone who's working in translational research that really emphasizes the impact that a spinal cord injury can have on an individual and the need for us to have progressive, teamwork-based interventions aimed at improving their quality of life so that individuals can adapt and thrive after a spinal cord injury. So thank you very much. We'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Vera and Chris, for that extremely insightful presentation, and for ending the presentation with that quote as a really important reminder to us all of the importance of integrated knowledge translation, and of really doing the work that we're doing to uptake evidence into practice a bit faster. So at this time, I will open up everyone's microphones so you can participate in asking any questions. Please feel free to ask anything or to use the chat box. And if you've muted yourself, you may need to unmute. If you have any questions, or if you have any thoughts for the presenters that you'd like to put into the chat box or verbally.
Alia, if nobody has any questions, if you guys want to share maybe your contact information as well, we can put that maybe on the recording as well so people can ask questions if they have any at a later date, if that works for the presenters before we log off.
Absolutely.
I'll
Vera,
do that as well.
What would be the best way of folks being able to contact you?
Yeah, so the best way would probably be over email. My email is vlucci, so VLUCCI at sfu.ca. And so yeah, that's the best way if there's anyone who has any questions that come up after this, or if anyone sees this recording after, to contact me. That would probably be best.
And likewise, if anyone wants to get in touch with the presenters, you can always contact me at the Fraser Center. So that's alia.januala@fraserhealth.ca, and I can connect you with the presenters or if you have any other questions.
So should we close it up?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but thank you all for attending today and giving us your time. I hope you all found this as informative as I did. Thank you, Vera and Chris, once again for your time in sharing your story and your research with us. We really appreciated being able to learn from you. And for everyone else on the line, please have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and please stay tuned for upcoming BC Support Unit webinars. I know there's quite a few exciting ones coming down the pipeline.
Thank you.
So with that, thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.